got a lot of knowledge to share with us about how autoimmune disease and parasites are connected. So welcome aboard, Evan. Thanks so much for being here with us today.
Hey, Dr. Osborne, thanks for having me. You know, it's been 5 years since this thing came full circle. I interviewed you for my podcast back in 2012.
5 years. Where does time go?
It goes quick.
It does. So tell our audience just a little bit about how you got into functional medicine and a little bit about your story.
Sure. Well, I think like most of us, I'm a wounded warrior. I had to get sick to get healthy, basically. And I started out with conventional diagnoses from medical doctors like IBS, depression. They wanted to put me on acid blockers. They wanted to put me on antispasmodic drugs. They wanted to put me on depression medication. I denied all the prescriptions because even before I knew about functional medicine, I knew just from a common sense perspective, depression's not a deficiency of Zoloft or Wellbutrin. Now, these medications may be necessary in some severe cases where people are just so in the dumps that they have to get pulled out. But for me, I was not quite that far down. And so I thought, well, what can I do with my nutrition to improve the way my brain was functioning? I was bodybuilding at the time. I went from about 120 to about 170 pounds. So I put on about 50 pounds over probably 3 or 4 years of intense stuffing my face with chicken breast and rice at the time, which I thought was the recipe to build muscle. I was bloated. I had acne. I still had depression issues. My sleep was still terrible. And then eventually my brain stopped working. So I was developing brain fog. And I thought, well, I should not be 20, 21 years old at the time with brain fog. Of course, that leads you down the path more and more and more. Something's going on with the gut. And a friend of mine who you know as well, Dr. Justin, looked at me. He saw me losing weight. I had lost about 25 pounds without trying in the span of a year after I moved down to Austin, Texas. I was working for a supplement company down there. I was formulating nutritional supplements. And he looked at me and he said, Evan, you've got a parasite. I'm like, oh, no, there's no way. I've never been out of the country. I drink clean water. My food is great. And he said, I'm telling you, you've got a parasite. You know, look at your fingernails. You've got these vertical ridges on your fingernails. I'm like, oh, crap. Okay. And it took me a few months to listen to him. Finally got the stool test run. In my first stool test, it was a biohealth 401H test that also looked for H. pylori. And I showed up with not one, but 2 parasites. I had Cryptosporidium and Giardia, which the more and more I talk with other functional medicine practitioners like yourself, people say, man, that's a double whammy to have as your first gut bugs. Long story short, went through an herbal protocol to successfully eradicate those parasites, retested my stool. The infections were cleared. Then I showed up with H. pylori. So apparently I had that in my gut as well, which if people have heard of H. pylori before, it's one of the most common causes of stomach ulcers. There's a lot of other symptoms you could get to, nausea, sometimes vomiting in extreme cases, especially just not feeling well after meals. That could be a sign of H. pylori as well. And so once again, went back on the herbs, which conventional medical doctors will laugh in your face. Get this, Peter, this is crazy. I had a client last week. He had a diagnosis of H. pylori through the conventional doctor. And he said, yeah, they put me on, I thought he was going to say triple therapy, which is the 3 antibiotics at the same time. He goes, no, they put me on quadruple therapy because apparently triple therapy is not working. So now it's 4 antibiotics at the same time. And I retested him. He still got H. pylori. And so for me, I'm a huge fan of the herbs because I successfully eradicated H. pylori and parasitic infections and bacterial infections like Pseudomonas aeruginosa was another one I had. And I did it all naturally. So basically what we're doing on a daily basis with herbs in functional medicine is impossible in the world of conventional medicine. And they laugh at the fact. There's websites dedicated, in fact, to making fun of herbs and how there's no way you can successfully eradicate parasites with them. But I see it and do it every single day. So I'm definitely a healed spirit and gut myself.
Yeah, so amazing. So full turnaround with identification and then subsequently with supplementation. I know, legally we can't make these claims that supplements would treat, cure, or diagnose or heal any form of disease. But what do you call it when the disease goes away after you use the supplements? I guess we just have to say it supported your health to the point you were able to make a recovery. But you're right. It's very common. A lot of GI doctors who should be on the forefront and on the cutting edge of this arena just continue to basically to poo-poo it, if you will, and not acknowledge that it's even an issue or even a problem. So interesting to hear your story. Let's talk a little bit about parasites themselves and autoimmune triggers. What is it that you would say are some of the biggest symptoms that somebody with a parasite, maybe they don't have, chronic diarrhea, like Giardia can cause diarrhea and vomiting and other things, but what are some of the other kind of more hidden symptoms that you might see somebody show up who's got parasites?
That's a good question. So joint pain is going to be one. I have migrating joint pain. For a while, I thought my wife and I both had Lyme disease because we have migrating joint pain. And so we got tested, and fortunately, it was just a couple of bacterial infections as well. So bacteria, parasites, yeast, there's a lot of things that we're up against when we're talking about gut health. A lot of the times, to be honest, the average is about 1 in 3 has some type of infection. So that could be parasitic, that could be bacterial, or that could be yeast as well. A lot of times it's a combination. Sarah's asking on the live chat, what about SIBO? Yeah, so SIBO is just a generic term, kind of like IBS. A lot of these bacterial infections that you're going to see, primarily they are going to occur in the small intestine. So that would be SIBO. And you can have parasite infections at the same time. So the joint pain, fatigue as well. I mean, I was exhausted. I would wake up, even though I went to bed, I had the good paleo sleep routine, right? Go to bed with the sun, 9 or 10 o'clock. I'd wake up at 8 or 9 a.m. I would think I would be fully rested, but I was not. Even after taking adaptogenic herbs, I was using rhodiola, I was using ashwagandha and holy basil to help support the adrenals because I knew my gut wasn't healthy. But even then, I was still fatigued. And so nutrient malabsorption. So if you eat a meal and you still feel hungry, or you can't go more than an hour after you eat dinner, you're already going for the dark chocolate or the wine or some type of snack. To me, it sounds like someone is stealing your nutrients, and that could be a gut bug. Headaches could be another one. Bags under the eyes, I've heard and seen that several times. Sometimes earaches as well. Sometimes it's kind of like a general jaw TMJ type issue. I've seen that with gut issues. Really, we could basically summarize and say, if you look up leaky gut symptoms, we know the toxins, the endotoxins that these bacteria and parasites are releasing, they're causing leaky gut, intestinal permeability. So anything that can be related to leaky gut, which is basically any symptom ever, could be linked to parasites as well.
Yeah. So I know one of the byproducts of parasite is formaldehyde. They actually produce a form of formaldehyde in the GI tract. It can serve to pickle your gut in a sense and break holes open so that other chemicals and proteins and things that you're eating that are normal, that would naturally be present in the gut but not be necessarily pathogenic, can now leak through into the bloodstream, overstimulate the immune system, and trigger an autoimmune response. So those are some of the symptoms. You mentioned you took some herbs and things. What kinds of herbs, Giardia, cryptosporidium were what you were suffering from. What did you find was more effective or most effective in your case?
Good question. So I had to use a blend. I mean, things like oregano are great. Garlic is a big one that I use often. There's a blend called AP Mag, like Alpha Paul AP Mag by Irish Herbs. It's a good one. Honestly, I couldn't list off the ingredients if you told me to right now because there's probably 7 or 9 different herbs in there. It's kind of like an Ayurvedic formula. But for any parasites, I'm always using that on top of using garlic, like maybe like a Designs for Health garlic, for example, because it's so strong. Or it depends, because for me, I also had candida, which I forgot to mention. I got the organic acid, which showed I had a massive yeast overgrowth as well. And so I had to use oregano oil on top of that for the yeast. So basically, to outline, garlic, oregano, berberine's great, black walnut, wormwood, barberry, bearberry. These are all anti-parasitic, antimicrobial. The cool thing is you can kill multiple birds with the same stones. So you may come in, like, for example, I had a lady who she's a teacher. She was having, 7 or 9 bouts of diarrhea per day. And she had a yeast infection, 3 bacterial infections, and I believe 2 parasites. So I think she had 7 infections in total. And so we just came in with a full comprehensive supportive program of all of that I just mentioned. On the retest, we had gotten rid of like 4 infections, but she still had 3 left. So then we had to come in and do a second round. And that's what I've had to do with myself as well, is sometimes when you're coming in, you're just crossing your fingers. Let's see how many infections we can kill on this first round. And depending on the person and their diet and their sleep and all of that, sometimes you kill 5 out of 7. Sometimes you kill 6 out of 7. Sometimes you kill 2 out of 3. Sometimes you kill all of them. And then you're like, wow, that was incredible. But it really just depends on the person.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Let's talk about time frame and taking. I personally, in my clinic, I have patients go on a 10-week protocol where we start this out with an initial flush, and I like to use vitamin C to flush out the gut. So I'll do a what's called a vitamin C flush, where we'll give them high doses of vitamin C over a span of a few hours. And it's like prepping for a colonoscopy. We're completely flushing the gut out so that if we have any easy accessible worms, any adult worms, any easy to get to larvae, that we can flush them out on day one. And that way, whatever's left over, we can go after with the antiparasitics. But that's me. What is it that you find is helpful or successful, like length of time, or any other kind of supportive supplementation that you might give someone?
Totally. So I want to ask you first about your vitamin C. How many grams are you doing? You doing 5 grams, 7 grams, or?
No. It's unique to the person. It ranges anywhere from 20 grams all the way up to 200 grams, depending on the individual. But it's 6 grams every 15 minutes until we have a watery stool is the general basis of doing it. So it's a powdered It's a powdered non-vitamin C derived organic vitamin C that it's powdered. So you mix it in 3 ounces of water. So 2 teaspoons is equivalent to about 6 grams. And we start them in the first thing in the morning on an empty stomach, because we don't want them just pooping out their food, right? So we start them on an empty stomach, and then, we get through the flush. It generally takes anywhere from 3 to 5 hours to get through a good flush. And then after the flush begins, you can start eating if you'd like to start eating. But we want to get just a clean colon, to minimize the warfare before we begin the battle.
Yeah, I love it. That's great. Yeah, so I was talking with Isabella Wentz, who's a mutual friend of ours, a couple of weeks ago on my podcast, and she said that now she's starting all of her clients out with like a liver support first. So that's something new that I'm trying, just because she mentioned that she's getting great results because a lot of her people were too sensitive. But for me, what I've done with great success so far is, depending on the person. Now, sometimes if they're too weak adrenally, I can't go straight to the gut. So we may have to do like 1 or 2 months of adrenal support first. And then now I'm incorporating some of the liver support. So like your milk thistle, the vitamin A, methionine, some of those other liver support nutrients for 1 to 2 weeks. And then the killing is 8 or 10 weeks, give or take. Because you know how it is with some of the bottle counts. Some may be 60 count of this, 120, 180 counts of that. So depending on the formula, 8 or 10 weeks. And then after that, I tell them to take 2 weeks off, where they've run out of the gut supplements and we're not going to retest yet. And then after those 2 weeks of waiting, then depending on the person, I intend to get them retested after that. And then we go into, if they're clear, then I'll take them into like a 4-week post-infection support, where I'll use like slippery elm, marshmallow root, chamomile flower, a lot of basically GI soothing nutrients. L-glutamine's incredible. I mean, people could take it before, but I just say save it till after, because we've got to kill the thing off that's actually causing the leaky gut. You could take all the leaky gut support in the world and take all these fancy online leaky gut online programs, but if you don't pull the weed out of the ground and kill off the bugs, you're kind of spinning your wheels, in my opinion. So the 4 weeks comes after, and then after that we just move on to other body systems.
Okay, I'm gonna pull this question up. Diana's chiming in. She has severe ankylosing spondylitis, and she's had some functional testing with Giardia and other parasites, as well as bacterial infections in the gut. She's working with a doctor to eliminate them for about 3 months now. Her GI symptoms are much improved, but her severe joint pain continues to disable her, and she can't perform activities of daily living. She's thinking about going back on a biologic like Enbrel for pain relief. So have you ever successfully eradicated gut infections while someone was on a biologic drug? Here's what I would say, Diana. I would say, first of all, a biologic drug is only going to suppress your immune system and reposition you for another infection. And so if you were on the biologic in the first place, it's probably why you ended up with the infections. If you were still suffering with severe pain, even though you were going through a gut protocol, and again, it's hard for me to know because I don't have your complete history here, but I would say, one, you need to have that doctor test you for all the different types of delayed food reactions, because food can oftentimes be a trigger for chronic persistent inflammatory joint dysfunction. You need to have them test you for vitamin and mineral deficiencies, including testing your omega-3 fatty acid levels, because you could be just hyperinflamed because of an imbalanced ratio in omega-3 to omega-6. And you absolutely, absolutely should consider reevaluating the gut. And I don't know what kind of tests that they performed. I mean, there are different kinds of tests that are out there, but I would make sure that your gut is fully sealed, because if you're treating that or having that being treated and your gut's not fully sealed, you're still getting leakage. And a lot of different kinds of infectious microorganisms, like Pseudomonas is one of them, Klebsiella is another. They actually they secrete endotoxins that mimic your cartilage. And in an AS, ankylosing spondylitis, it's going to go, basically your immune system's attacking the bacteria, but it gets confused and thinks that your cartilage is the bacteria, and it allows to continually persist to attack you. So that molecular mimicry process has to be stopped, and the only way we're going to stop it is to seal your gut. So before you just make that jump back into Enbrel, get back with your doctor and explore those potentials if you haven't already. Any other things that you want to add to that, Evan?
Yeah, I appreciate it. She said she ran the GI map. She commented on there. So that is a pretty darn good stool test. I find a lot more infections on that than some other labs out there. I would also say, I mean, if she's got the severe joint pain, I know she's already had the autoimmune arthritis diagnosis, but if you've not already, looking for Epstein-Barr, looking for Lyme, looking for all of these co-infections. My wife had miserable joint pain that, even though we had worked on her gut and adrenals and all of that, she still had joint pain. And so she had mycoplasma pneumonia, which was found on a blood test. And we did a lot of high quality immune support, including astragalus. Now, depends on the person. You might not be able to do astragalus, but that's just what we did for her. So I would say look for the co-infections, get the IGeneX test for Lyme, and just see if you've got those, because it sounds like there may be some pieces that have not been uncovered yet.
Yeah, good points. Good points. Crystal's chiming in. What about PCOS, where a lot of foods bother the gut? It is said that it could be caused by autoimmune issues. How would one treat this with herbs for bloat, fertility, and general wellness? Well, PCOS is an autoimmune disease. I think you should understand that. It's a form of autoimmune diabetes of the uterus and ovaries, and that's part of the issue, is that that's an active autoimmune condition. What would you? I'm going to default back to Evan here. He's our guest today. Evan, any dealings with this, parasites and PCOS, or gut bugs and PCOS?
Yeah. So first, we've got to make sure the diet's in order. Now, if she's already been following your work, she's probably already working on the diet piece, but a lot of people want to jump to, oh, give me the best herb for fertility and wellness and all that. But we don't know, if she's been on an autoimmune paleo diet, she's been on a grain-free diet for a while, and we know that she's super clean. She's got low toxicity in terms of chemicals, glyphosates, and other types of pesticides and herbicides. Okay, perfect. We know that the diet's in order. Now, first, then we've got to look at the adrenals too, figure out how you're doing there. Are you strong enough to handle a gut protocol to go into these herbs? And then secondly, you've got to get tested, because ultimately there's a million supplements out there that might help you. But my philosophy is, if you don't test, you've guessed. And so you've really got to get some of the clinical data on a piece of paper first, put your map, your roadmap on the table, and then look at each body system, see how that's functioning, and then you could proceed. But if you did want me to give you a couple general recommendations for herbs, I'm a huge fan of the adaptogens. So you've got your Shajandra berries, you've got your holy basils, you've got your ashwagandhas, which I mentioned already, you've got maca, you've got rhodiola, you've got eleuthero or Siberian ginseng. There's so many, and it's generally, depending on the person, once again, generally these are very safe, and you can use these regardless of what the condition is that you're up against. And they just help you to adapt. That's why they call it adaptogen. So they're not going to stimulate you necessarily, although they can. Like holy basil, when I first started taking that, I felt like I was a warrior, and I felt invincible. It was crazy. And so yes, you can go too much with these, but just kind of baby step your way up with some of these herbs. And I've helped many women become pregnant just by fixing their gut, believe it or not. I had a woman actually who emailed me the other day, and she says, thank God I'm over my morning sickness. She struggled with fertility for years. The doctor said, look, you're going to have IVF, the in vitro fertilization is going to be about $10,000 or $12,000. And she said, well, this is my last ditch effort, is to come to you before I do that. And she had parasites. My intention was not necessarily for her to become pregnant. I just needed to work on the gut. And by accident, oops, she was fertile again.
Yeah, and by accident, So yeah, I've seen the same thing happen. Women come to me a lot of times for other reasons, and they're also infertile, and then they end up having babies about halfway into the treatment because their bodies get healthier.
It's crazy. Now she wanted a kid, so she was not protecting herself. But I'm sure there are some accidental babies out there that that have happened due to just fixing the gut, for example. It's just amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go with this question here. Any recommended course of treatment to conquer histamine intolerance? This person talking about a GI protocol with somebody with a histamine intolerance. What do you say there?
That's tough. Honestly, with the histamines, you've got to figure out exactly what your triggers are, like you mentioned. So maybe Cyrex Labs is where you start, and you really try to look at some of these foods and figure out what are some of these undiagnosed sensitivities. For me, I had to cut out avocado, for example. I never would have thought avocado would have given me migraine headaches, but it did. So for you really have to start with food. And then in terms of treatment, it's going to depend. You've got to basically get a diet dialed in where you're as minimally symptomatic as you can. And then once again, just work your way through the body systems, adrenals, gut, detox, thyroid. You've got to look at all those after that.
I would say a lot of people with histamine intolerance have environmental allergens that they're not controlling well enough, and that's their mast cells, their white blood cells that are responsible for regulating allergies, are going crazy, releasing excessive histamine. And until you block that excess, either through environmental change, or I like to use vitamin C and quercetinase or quercetin and bromelain. These are all natural antihistamines that do very, very well for a lot of folks who have what they would consider to be a histamine intolerance. So they're avoiding all the foods that contain histamine for the sake of the symptoms that they're experiencing. But I would say, in my experience, generally, if you block histamines naturally with a good vitamin C and bromelain and quercetinase, you're going to go a long way to making that person much more tolerable. I would also say get IgE tested as well, because IgE, there are different kinds of antibody reactions that you can have. You can have IgG, IgA, IgM, IgD, IgE, immune complex, T cell responses. These are all different kinds of immune responses. And if you've had a traditional allergy test done, a lot of docs and a lot of functional medicine practitioners will run an IgG subtype 4, which is a delayed hypersensitivity allergy type of test, but it won't show you IgE. IgE is the antibody responsible for histamine release. So, for example, you can be not allergic to, I'm going to just throw this out there, not allergic to watermelon, right? But in IgE, you are allergic to watermelon. So you may not produce the antibody IgG against watermelon, but if you're producing IgE, it'll still cause a histaminic release that leads to symptoms and leads to histamine output. And so it's very possible, if you haven't had IgE food tested. Now, a lot of times, again, docs won't do that part of the testing. They will do skin prick testing, or they will do IgE for environmental stuff like dust, pollen, molds, but they won't test for foods. So have somebody go back in and test for foods, because it's very possible you have some subacute reactions that are going on that are just driving your histamine up all the time. And there's a grading classification on IgE testing. The grading classification goes from the score of 0 to 6. If you have a 4, 5, or a 6 score, that's indicative of an anaphylactic to near anaphylactic response. Those are obvious allergens. And so those are the things where if you eat them, your lips would swell, your throat would constrict, you'd break out in hives, you'd have obvious allergy symptoms. But you can have a grade 1, 2, or 3, which is a subacute reaction, which won't cause the obvious symptoms. It acts more like kind of a hidden allergy, and it can raise your heart rate. It can cause more mast cell production or more mast cell degranulation, which is going to lead to more histamine release. But it doesn't necessarily cause an obvious blatant symptom externally. So having that IgE tested, paying close attention to the grade 1, 2, and 3 that comes back on the test, and making sure that you're not being told, don't worry about grade 1 and 2, because I see this all the time where people have grade 1 or 2 allergies, and until we get them off of those foods, they're really not they're not having a response or recovery.
Wow. So what lab would you recommend? Is there one that's going to include the IgE and all of them together, or are you going to have to order separate panels?
No, it's separate labs. So this is part of the problem, is a lot of doctors get really, really fond of one particular lab, which is why there's no one best lab for everything in the world. There's lots of
Yeah.
different really, really wonderful labs, including Quest and LabCorp do some great testing. But no, IgE testing has to be done uniquely separate from IgG, IgA, IgM, immune complex, and T cells. So it's really a battery of different labs that have to be done in order to get an accurate overall representation of what the person's immune system is doing in response to foods and chemicals.
Yeah, well said. One general thing that may help too in terms of the environmental, if you're looking for a specific recommendation, I've used both the Aller Ease from Pure and the Hista Ease from Designs. Those are both great products, and I've had people that have worked with their prescribing medical doctor to actually get off their inhalers just by using some of these natural histamine formulas. And I was actually shocked when I heard stuff like that. And also making sure you've got good, clean indoor air. I mean, we spend so much time indoors, so make sure you can open your windows 10, 15 minutes a day, and then also make sure you've got a really high quality HEPA and/or activated carbon, charcoal, multi-stage filters. Make sure your indoor environment is clean. You don't have any IKEA furniture that's off-gassing, like the formaldehyde, like you mentioned earlier with the gut bugs. I mean, you breathe this stuff in too. So, clean up the air.
Yeah, good point. Let's see here. There was a question that came across, a bunch of questions, but there's one particularly I want to give you an opportunity to answer, and it's +4 Klebsiella, which was not improved after diet change. Here we go. In conjunction with biocidin as well as an antibiotic treatment. So go ahead, Evan. What would you say with that one?
Yeah, so I'm guessing with the 4+ like that, I'm guessing that was a readout from like a biohealth stool test. That's typically how they read those out for Klebsiella. And let's see, has not improved after diet change in conjunction with biocidin and antibiotic. Well, I'm not a huge fan of the antibiotic. It's not necessary. It's only going to cause more problems. It's only going to make our job more difficult, and we're going to have to do a lot more backtracking to get you back to the point where you were pre-antibiotic with your gut health. Now, our microbiome is post-antibiotic, so we're going to have to first do some of that work just to get us back to where we were before that. Don't beat yourself up over it, but that's just the reality. And if it hasn't worked with the biocidin, well, it sounds like that's just not comprehensive of an approach enough. Also, just to make sure you're taking a look at your thyroid too, because we do know that there's a link between Klebsiella and Hashimoto's. So I would urge you, if you've not already, make sure you get your thyroid antibodies run, your TG, your TPO, all of the different antibodies, your TSI. And then if it hasn't improved with the biocidin, you've likely got to use, for me, I'm a big fan, once again, of the garlic, the oregano, the berberines, the black walnuts, the wormwoods, all of these. Some of the time you can separate these, but sometimes it's more cost effective for a client if we just give them a blend that has many of these herbs together. Because if it's just Klebsiella by itself, maybe we would isolate, say, garlic, oregano. But if we've got other stuff too, like a yeast overgrowth, which I wouldn't be surprised because you did antibiotics, it's very common to have yeast afterwards, you may need something more comprehensive. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, I would just simply add, if they tested you for Klebsiella, maybe ask that doctor to go back and do a sensitivity test. A lot of labs will, once you identify a bacteria, they'll actually test to see what is most effective at killing it. So, for example, in my experience, where we do a ton of sensitivity, I get a lot of Klebsiella in the office in patients, and one of the most common things that we see Klebsiella, at least, again, this is going to be unique to where you live in the world too, because I talk with colleagues who see similar things, but they see completely different effective agents for different bacteria. Like in my neck of the woods, if you've got Klebsiella, then there's a strong likelihood that berberine is going to be the best tool to use. But I've got colleagues in California and Louisiana, and when we talk, they're not seeing berberine sensitivity at all. They're seeing Klebsiella as being better killed by oregano or better killed by garlic. So it depends on what the bacteria that you have is sensitive to, and there can be they can run a test. Your doc can run a test that can give you a sensitivity response for the bacteria to see what is going to be most effective at killing it. And I think one of the obvious things that neither one of us has said, but I know we both do, and that's probiotics. Yeah. Like a lot of times people will go on this bacterial kill mission and they won't support during the process. They won't support with probiotics. When you're going through something like Klebsiella, you need a minimum of about 250 billion colony forming units of probiotic every day. I recommend taking that right before bedtime, and getting at least that much in you of a good quality lactobacillus or bifidobacter, or combination of the two. And if you do the proper kind of GI testing, a lot of times they'll measure your microbiome and find out if you have a deficiency in these types of bacteria and these good guy bacteria, because part of keeping an infection at bay, part of keeping an abnormal bacteria at bay, is providing the gut with the healthy flora that are supposed to colonize it. And think of your gut as a neighborhood. You've only got so many houses. And if a bunch of drug dealers move into the neighborhood, the house values are going to go down. But if you fill the houses with great neighbors, who look out for each other, which is what probiotics are, then there's a lot less of a likelihood that a bad guy is going to move into the neighborhood and really start taking over. So probiotic support during all of this is very critical as well.
Yeah, well said. I was going to ask you a question. Explain, why would someone want to take probiotics in the evening? What's the benefit there for people curious?
The benefit is you get an entire night of lying horizontally where there's no food interference, there's no stress interference, there's no biochemical interference from the day that is going to affect the neurology of the gut and the motility of the gut. So you're going to get those bacteria going in where there's no acid being secreted because you're trying to digest a meal. So you've got a better opportunity and a better likelihood for those bacteria to get down into the large and small intestine where they can populate, where they don't have to battle the stomach acid because you ate it with a meal. So we really just want a rested gut. Probiotics work at the very, very best on a rested gut where the gut is not being bombarded with other things, because then the gut's going to secrete. Think about all the things that the GI tract makes. You make stomach acid, then you make bicarbonate, which is something the pancreas secretes. Then after the bicarbonate comes through, you make elastase and lipase and amylase and protease. And all these things, these enzymes, some of them can potentially destroy good bacteria, right? Depending on the location. So like most of our good bacteria is going to colonize the large intestine. And so we want it to make that whole route. We want it to get through the stomach, get through the small intestine, where then it can start setting up shop when it gets to the large intestine. So the less we have going on in the GI tract when we take it, which is usually at night, because there's an 8 to 10 to potentially a 12-hour fast there, where we're not telling the gut to digest things or to secrete chemicals that could harbor or hinder the ability for probiotics to colonize.
I love it. That's such a simple thing to do, but I mean, the effects of timing is so critical. I think that's undervalued a lot of the time.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. A lot of people just it's kind of like, if you throw enough water at the fire, you can put the fire out. But if somebody's on the back porch pouring gas, right, you don't see them and they're not there. It's one of those things is that you think I'm doing it right, but maybe there's something you could be doing better, like taking the guy out who's pouring the gas, right?
Yep.
Let's see here. Kathy's asking about mycoplasma pneumonia. How does she get rid of? Her son has been battling Lyme, joint pain, and swelling along with mycoplasma for 6 years. It's one of those co-infections. Evan, you want to crack at that?
Yeah, I sure will. It's a tough one, Kathy. Now, like I mentioned for my wife, she did not have Lyme. She just had the mycoplasma, so I can't speak upon whether it makes it harder to kill if you are battling Lyme at the same time. But if you haven't already, look into the work of Stephen Buhner. He's got a great book on healing Lyme, and he's going to be able to have much more detailed protocols than I would be able to discuss in this interview. But yeah, I mean, the astragalus, the cat's claw, there's a lot of immunomodulating herbs that can be really effective and safe for long-term use. I personally do what Buhner suggests, which is take 1 to 3 grams of astragalus during tick season, which is basically the summer, because my wife and I go hiking all the time. The ticks are already bad this year. I don't know about you down in Texas, but here in Kentucky, the ticks are terrible already. And we're seeing tiny, tiny ones where you could almost mistake it as a freckle. And those small ones, those could still transfer these bacteria. So prevention is key. If you don't have it yourself, Kathy, that's great. But yeah, go look at Stephen Buhner's work. I think he's going to really give you some helpful strategies.
I would throw in there, with something like that, if your son's diet isn't right, and it's where so many people make the mistake. They identify infections or they have somebody working with them, but their diet is just not what it's supposed to be. And if the diet's inflammatory, pro-inflammatory, or hindering the process of the immune system to work appropriately, then no treatment's going to work, no matter how effective it could be. No treatment's going to work if the diet is not serving the patient. If the diet is creating a critical immune response that is detracting or distracting your immune system from the infection. So a lot of people are eating foods they're allergic to, and so that tells their immune system, attack the food. Well, the food is supposed to nourish you. And if that's happening, then your immune system, not only is it diverted away from killing the infections, now it's attacking what's supposed to be nourishing you. So now we have two problems. So the diet has to be clean if you want your immune system to be strong enough to make a recovery. One of the other things I would recommend, and I just got this reformulated, it's called Autoimmune IgG. It is a serum-derived antibody formula that is designed to bind pathogens in the GI tract and prevent them from going through a leaky gut. And this is a product that I had designed. I designed it several years ago, but our manufacturing supply source dried up and we could no longer get access to it. Well, it's taken us a few years, but we've finally gotten it back. So that's something else that you can consider is called Autoimmune IgG.
That sounds amazing. And just to clarify, anybody that's asking any question, the starting point is always going to be good sleep, movement, sunlight, good relationships, getting rid of, negative people in your life. If you've got bad relationships, dropping them. If you've got to get a divorce because you're in an abusive relationship, you've got to get that stuff taken care of. If you're surrounded by EMF, you've got to cut your Wi-Fi off, go hardwired like I've done in my house. I've got a little 10-month-old daughter, so I've no Wi-Fi. And autoimmune diet, that's your foundation. And then the question comes on top of that. So if all that's there, all that foundation's in place, okay, cool. Now we can play ball with all of these other things we're talking about.
Yeah, well said, well said. Well, I think we've got a ton of questions still here left, but I think we're hitting a wall here. My staff's telling me I got another appointment coming up. Evan, thanks so much for being here. This was great. I love doing this with you. Tell our audience where they can find you and learn more about what you're doing in the world.
Sure. Thanks for having me. It's great fun to be with you, and love to get you back on my podcast. So that's where people can start. If they just type in Evan Brand, like brand name, they'll find me. I run the Not Just Paleo podcast, and we've hit over 6 million downloads. I've been on the air every single week. I think I've only missed 1 week in 5 years, and that's because I was moving cross country and I couldn't find a Wi-Fi hotspot to upload. But other than that, every single week, and you've been a guest on there, which it's been a while. It's been 5 years, so you're due. And I've written a couple books, one on sleep, one on stress. I wrote a third book with the publisher on nootropics, which are brain vitamins, which is a whole nother category for another day to talk about. But people can check that out. And then I run a online functional medicine clinic too. So I do offer 15-minute free calls. If they're struggling, they want me to hear them out, hear what kind of symptoms they've got going on, see if they're a good fit for care. All that info is back at my website. So that's notjustpaleo.com.
All right. Excellent. Excellent. Well, again, Evan, I appreciate you being here, and thanks for doing what you're doing out there in the world. For those of you tuning in today, we will be back again next Friday for our Facebook Friday Live. So if your question didn't get answered, make sure you show up next week. And we'll do our best to get everything answered for you. Until then, have a great, great weekend, and we'll see you on the flip side.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.